Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Hilaal Live. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us, and of course, my colleague Lukman Shadrack for taking you through that first part of the show. Now, 5 countries, including South Africa and Bangladesh, have called for an international criminal court investigation into Israel's indiscriminate war on the Gaza Strip, which has left over 12,000 people, among them more than 5,000 children, dead. Most concerning is the continuous attacks on hospitals and schools, and Israel continues to claim that Hamas is using these facilities as underground military bases, most of which is still to be verified. Joining us now, I'd like to welcome Abdul Kayum Ahmed. He's a special advisor on the right to health at Human Rights Watch. Kayum, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and jazakallah so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
It's an absolute pleasure. Kayum, if you can, maybe just break down the timeline for, of course, war crime charges to be given to a country like, for example, Israel. We've seen here in South Africa, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa has referred what is happening in Gaza to the International Criminal Court. So if you could just break down that, that timeline and, of course, how this constitutes.
Human Rights Watch has found historically that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. And this is a finding that predates the October 7th attacks that we see currently unfolding at the moment. The findings of apartheid and crimes against humanity are based on an overarching Israeli government policy to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians and grave abuses committed against Palestinians living in the occupied territory, including in East Jerusalem. Now, the International Criminal Court prosecutor certainly has jurisdiction over the current hostilities between Israel and Palestinian armed groups that covers unlawful conduct by all parties. The Rome Statute, which is what governs the International Criminal Court, prohibits as a war crime intentionally directing attacks against medical units and transport. And so Israeli and Palestinian officials really have to then cooperate with the Commission and the ICC in their work. The challenge with hospitals is that there's quite specific international law that prohibits attacks on hospitals, and there are certain exceptions to the law, which Israel is attempting to manipulate, we argue, in order to advance attacks on hospitals, and we see what's currently unfolding at Al-Shifa. But the timeline for ICC prosecutions very much depends on the prosecutor himself and how he plans to develop the evidence required to persecute Israel for war crimes. In previous cases, we have found that the ICC has acted quite expeditiously in the case of the Russian attacks against Ukraine. In this instance, we have noted the slow pace at which the ICC prosecutor is operating. And so we welcome South Africa's position on taking this matter to the ICC. And South Africa is, of course, joined by 4 other countries who have also decided to refer the current crisis to the ICC. And so all we can really do is to ensure that we continue to place pressure on the International Criminal Court to ensure that they prosecute these crimes as quickly and as expeditiously as possible.
And that's why I want to bring in, obviously, Kayum, hospitals and schools. So we saw, of course, as we speak at this very moment, and so much more can happen, due to, of course, a lot of connectivity cuts within Gaza, the Indonesian hospital that is currently being surrounded by Israeli tanks. 5 weeks ago, the Al-Aqsa hospital, which was blown up, Israel says that this came from Hamas rockets. And then, of course, Al-Shifa hospital. Hospitals and schools is a unique case, isn't it, Kayum? The school, of course, I'm referring to is the UN refugee school that was attacked this past weekend. So when the case is being brought to the International Criminal Court, how do these lawyers bring about it, especially in a case with regards to schools and hospitals?
A really good point. I think Israel's broad-based attack on Gaza's healthcare system is really an attack on the sick and the injured, on babies in incubators, on pregnant people, on cancer patients. And these actions certainly need to be investigated as war crimes in the same way that attacks on schools, which are also have protected status under international humanitarian law, need to be investigated as war crimes. There is a strong presumption in international humanitarian law that hospitals should not be attacked because of the incredible harm to patients, doctors, and those sheltering in hospitals experience. And in the cases we investigated at Human Rights Watch, we found that the Israeli Defense Force did not put forward any or sufficient justifications that would make an attack on such facilities proportionate, nor have they provided any meaningful warnings or shown why warnings weren't necessary. And they also called for people to leave hospitals with nowhere to go in what we describe as a broad-based and indeterminate way, putting patients at risk. I've been on calls with a number of healthcare workers in Gaza over the last few weeks. And the kinds of conditions that they have described to me are absolutely horrific and harrowing. One doctor I spoke to at Al Quds Hospital told me that he had to make a decision about who would have access to machines, to certain life-saving machines in an ICU. And when he decided to remove an older person from one of these life-saving machines and placed a younger person on the machine, he discovered subsequently that the person he removed from the ICU bed was in fact the father of the child that he had saved. And so this child was ultimately left with no surviving relatives or parents as a result of these actions. And these young doctors that I talked to are grappling with the life and death choices that they've been forced to make under really, really difficult conditions. So what the ICC needs to take into consideration is not only the international humanitarian law framework, which I think is very clear on attacks on hospitals, but also testimony from doctors and healthcare workers who have been working in these spaces, and the kinds of decisions that they have to make will certainly feed into the narrative of trying to paint a picture of Israel's attacks on hospitals and on schools. And the UN, of course, has made some very clear pronouncements about these attacks. They have indicated very, very clearly that these attacks amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. And so it is a matter for the ICC prosecutor to make these determinations and then to have both sides present their case and ultimately make a decision. The challenge with the ICC, as with any legal process, is that it often takes many, many years before we will come to a final conclusion and a determination about what has unfolded. And so one of the limitations of the international humanitarian law framework is that it's often backward looking. It looks at crimes that have already occurred and attempts to correct these crimes or make some sort of reparations for these crimes. And this is why we need to combine some of the ongoing legal strategies with the advocacy tactics and strategies that are being used in places such as the United States, where there are protests almost every other day to try and put pressure on the US government, in addition to Western powers who are equally, in our view, to blame for what's unfolding in the Middle East at the moment.
Okay, you mentioned past conflicts, and let's look back at 2008 to 2009, and then after that, there have been 3 separate wars that have happened on Gaza. Does this strengthen the case for the lawyers that are bringing the case forward to the International Criminal Court for those war crime charges to be executed against Israel? Or is this maybe something that needs to be looked at in a magnifying glass with each and every one of them, and then onwards, of course, the prosecutors will look at it and say, right, we have to look at all of these 4 different wars that are happening and take each one as they stand? Or is it a combined one that comes together? Could you maybe give us an explanation with regards to that, please?
I think it's important that we connect the dots between these different attacks that have taken place in Gaza and across Palestine by Israel over the past 100 years. And starting with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the UK's role in parceling off pieces of Palestine to create a Jewish state. And then, of course, subsequent developments that have taken place with the role that the United States has played, the post-World War II era. The historical context, I think, is critically important in making sense of what is currently unfolding at the moment. And so while the law does tend to focus on specific incidents or attacks against hospitals, and there's very much an attempt to use, as you said, a magnifying glass to focus on specific attacks, and let's say the Al-Shifa hospital attack at the moment would be used as a certain case that could be amplified in the International Criminal Court. At the same time, it's important to not decontextualize what's going on now in relation to what's been happening over the past couple of decades. And so the ICC is going to require experts, both of history, of law, experts who understand the current conditions that are playing out, in order to piece together a full picture of what's unfolding. I think it's also important to recognize that Israel's repeated and what we would regard as apparently unlawful attacks on medical facilities, personnel, and transport are, of course, ongoing, sort of decimating the Gaza Strip's healthcare system. And so we recognize that while the ICC is going to play an important role in looking back at what's been happening over the last 40-something days as war crimes, it's also important to try and figure out what can be done now to try and prevent the ongoing atrocities that are unfolding in Gaza and across Palestine. I know a lot of attention is often paid to what's unfolding in Gaza. I returned from the West Bank a couple of months ago and can tell you that the situation there is particularly acute and challenging as well. And the World Health Organization has also documented attacks on what's unfolding in the West Bank, even though the West Bank is not controlled by Hamas. And so the Israeli government's assertion that these attacks and that their war is really one focused on what they refer to as eradicating Hamas fails to hold up in any court of law, given that these attacks have also extended to the West Bank, where Hamas has no control or authority. And so I think that the prosecutor is going to have to look at both contexts holistically, as well as the historical context that has led to where we are at the moment.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Kayum Ahmed. We're going to be talking impunity, and does it actually apply to Israel? Do stay tuned to Hilaal Live. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. I'm still in conversation with Abdul Kayum Ahmed from Human Rights Watch. Kayum, before we speak about impunity and whether it really implies with Israel, I want to talk about public perception within the United States of America. Where you are, of course, in New York City, there have been countless of protests. In the court of public opinion, from an American perspective, President Joe Biden and his cabinet have lost that war of public opinion, have they?
It seems very much that there's an incredible turn in the United States at the moment that is incredible to observe and to watch. In addition to working at Human Rights Watch as a special advisor, I also teach at Columbia University and have an affiliation at Harvard University. And what's unfolding on campuses across the United States has been really fascinating to see. Many of my students who are historically white students, upper middle class students from the United States have really been placing incredible pressure, not only on academic institutions, but also on the Biden administration to call for a ceasefire in what they see as an absolutely horrific war being perpetrated against Palestine and Palestinians. And so the shift and the turn in US public sentiment, I think, is critically important, and it adds to the ongoing pressure on the Biden administration. Biden, of course, has an election coming up. It's likely that he will run against Donald Trump next year. And so it's an important time to assert a particular view on what's unfolding. The US's support of Israel, we find as deeply problematic, together, of course, with the support being offered by other Western states. But the US in particular has historically played an important role in bolstering and supporting Israeli apartheid and Israeli settler colonialism. And so it's important that pressure continue to be applied on the United States government. And I think that the protests we see unfolding at the moment contribute to and add to that pressure. I should mention that some universities have also decided to ban student organizations, Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, who is very outspoken and a pro-BDS organization, have both been banned at places such as Columbia University, where I teach, and faculty have subsequently come to the defense of students. I, together with 200 faculty, signed a letter of support for students who are currently being doxxed by doxing trucks that are parking outside of the university. The situation is incredibly tense. And what we're attempting to as faculty is to continue to support students as well as others who are advancing the call for a ceasefire in these contexts in the United States in particular. But it's not only unique to New York. We see these protests unfolding across the US, and again, led primarily by young people, young Americans, who are completely disillusioned by the United States' ongoing support of Israel at all costs. And I think it's made it really apparent that the situation is completely untenable. It's interesting that the discourse that's currently being advanced in New York City in particular is that the Biden administration has failed to assert its moral and legal authority to advance and realize various rights, human rights of Palestinians. And I think this pressure will continue to build. We are not seeing any cessation of the pressure at all. And in fact, there are almost daily protests taking place across the United States, which I must say, when I talk to folks in Gaza, there is a deep sense of feeling supported by the outside world. When I tell them about the protests taking place in South Africa, there is a sense of solidarity. And so all of these protests continue to play a really important role, not only in placing political pressure on governments, but also in showing solidarity and support to the people in Palestine. And I think for them, these protests are incredibly meaningful.
And I'm going to get your take on the global opinion of what is happening, of course, in Gaza in a bit, Kayum. But Kayum, I want to talk about impunity. A couple of weeks ago, we saw the first part of the UN General Assembly voting in favor of a ceasefire. Israel, of course, did not adhere to it. We saw another one last week being voted, and Israel, again, did not adhere to it. Is there a case right now, and as Human Rights Watch, of course, found, that impunity just seems to not be the word that Israel looks at and says, well, you know what, we don't actually care what happens. We're going to continue with it, and we are a rule above ourselves.
Precisely. And I think there's been a history of this level of impunity. If you look at the numerous General Assembly resolutions that have been adopted over the years by the United Nations, there is a clear indication that Israel has completely ignored or refuses to adhere to the rule of law, despite it referring to itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. But before October 7th, I think it's important to also recognize that there were a huge range of protests unfolding in Israel prior to October 7th, deeply unhappy about the Netanyahu government and what it was doing to the judicial system in Israel. So Israelis themselves are not unified on what's unfolding in Palestine at the moment. I think we often make the assumption that everyone in Israel has the same attitude, belief, and approach in supporting the Israeli attacks against Palestine. But there are a huge number of Israelis who have taken a very different view, have protested the use of force in the way in which Israel has continued to do, but also pointed fingers at the Israeli government's failure to ensure that democracy, the rule of law, and that justice prevails within Israel prior to October 7th. And so these tensions that continue to play out in Israeli society fracture this notion that Israel is a homogeneous Jewish state, which of course is really an attempt by Israel to advance a certain narrative that I think everyone can see through. And so the attempts by the Israeli government to continue this level of impunity are not only attracting voices of dissent from outside Israel, but also from within Israel. And we're hoping that these two forces of dissent and the disobedience against the Israeli government will eventually result in their shift in policy toward Palestine. This we recognize is going to be a long, long battle ahead, but I think it's critically important that we continue to place the kind of advocacy and legal pressure on Israel, as well as UN pressure on the state of Israel, to continue ensuring that those who are suffering under Israeli apartheid and hostilities, when eventually this matter comes before court, and we hope this is soon, we'll be able to document and show how Israel has failed to ensure the implementation of the rule of law and of international humanitarian law.
Kayum, one final question. In the court of the global opinion, Palestine has won the war. Whatever PR campaign that Israel and, of course, the West have had, it seems to be not being bought into by the global world. As a South African, of course, Kayum, you saw the final days of apartheid and how boycotts had really hit the National Party government. Is it going to take that for the International Criminal Court and the United Nations to hold Israel accountable? Is the court of public opinion going to be the one that can play the final role or the final nail in the coffin in this accountability phase? Because we see that there are governments, even in the West, Norway and Spain particularly, are starting to recognize Palestine and want Israel to be held accountable. How's that timeline going in terms of the public opinion of the world and the role that it's playing?
It's a really, really good question. And I think we can't understate the role of public opinion and the public pressure and advocacy tactics that are being employed by a range of actors, from young students, as I was mentioning, to global human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as governments across the world. I think in particular, the governments from the global south are the ones that I'm paying certain attention to. I think they have called out the hypocrisy of the global north in failing to treat the question of Palestine in the same way as they have the question of Ukraine. And I think this discrepancy in the way in which international actors assert the laws of war are certainly seen for what they are. The challenge, of course, is that while public opinion is critically important, we're going to have to continue and maintain the pressure on governments to ensure that they actually bow to this public pressure. Because what often happens in cases such as this, when situations are drawn out for a long period, people's attention spans and tend to shift toward the latest issue that's unfolding. And I think it's therefore important for us to continue through programs such as yours to ensure that the public does not lose the sense of importance that needs to be played and the pressure that needs to continue to be placed on governments across the world to ensure that Palestine is liberated. And so while the court of public opinion is absolutely essential, I think this needs to be done in conjunction with advocacy tactics, the law, as well as a number of other pressure points that can be placed on Israel.
Okay. Jazakallah so much for making time for us here on Hilaal Live. Always appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Absolute pleasure. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That is Abdul Kayum Ahmed, Special Advisor on the Right to Health at Human Rights Watch. After the break, I'll have your latest in news. Do stay tuned.